The overall title for them is Mythbusters. We've gone through Rorke's Drift, we've seen how that's nothing like the film. We went through Balaclava and we saw that that wasn't quite the disaster it's made out to be, and not so many hundreds of men died in that as first you're led to believe when you read superficial histories. Then we looked at Merbat, where 9 SAS guys took on 400 Adie tribesmen, communist-backed tribesmen, and how they pulled that off miraculously for fighting for 5 hours. And now the Battle of Waterloo. Hands up if you've seen the film.
Just come out.
No, that's Napoleon. Close.
Oh, right.
Don't laugh. He's only young.
He's thinking Waterloo Road, I think.
He's thinking of Waterloo Road. How many have heard that ABBA song? Yeah. If you want to see a really good film about the battle, obviously it's called The Battle of Waterloo, made in the 70s. Rod Steiger plays Napoleon, Christopher Plummer plays the Duke of Wellington. It's very good, and all the key parts of the battle that I'm going to talk about are shown in the film. What's so good about the film Waterloo is Dino De Laurentiis, the director, had alongside him to help him with the massive panoramas and troop movements, the Russian Red Army. They supplied about 15,000 men. And that's why the film Waterloo, if you get to see it, is really brilliant, especially the panoramic views of the armies, the massed attacks. It's very, very good. Anybody seen the Sharp series? Yeah? So unlike Sharp, you haven't got 50 men running around trying to look like 5,000. In the film Waterloo, you've actually got big amounts of guys, big amount of numbers of guys. It's very, very good. Okay, so let's think about the main contenders. Very quickly, you probably know that the Battle of Waterloo is about Napoleon fighting Wellington. A lot of people don't know that there was a Prussian involved and his name was Blücher. Quick character study of those guys. Napoleon, okay, he was a produce of Corsica. Unlike the recent film, he wasn't from nothing. He was actually from gentry in Corsica, so he was actually quite well off. He was trained to be an artillery officer. He was remarkably gifted at all his studies, and basically there are people who have a gifting for things and are just genius at things, and for some weird thing like Alexander or Frederick the Great, Napoleon was just brilliant military leader. But that wasn't his own skill. He also was good for France as well, as France was coming out of the French Revolution. He created systems within the government and within the country that were also helpful. So he wasn't completely just a one-trick pony. He was also good for France. He was bad for France in the sense that they reckon there was over 1 million Frenchmen killed while he was commander-in-chief or emperor of France. So for 15 years, over 15 years or so, the French army dominated Europe. They basically won almost every battle. He had a few near-run things, which is what Wellington will call Waterloo later. He had a couple of draws, and you could argue a couple of misses. But generally speaking, his military genius was such that he won decisively, and what he did often was brilliant. He could pull victory out of near defeat. That's the younger Napoleon. By the time we get to Waterloo 1815, Wellington and Napoleon are the same age, they're 47. But Napoleon has had a lot of campaigning. He had the disastrous campaign in Russia, 1812. There's an overture named after that, worth listening to if you've never heard it, by Tchaikovsky. But he was suffering health-wise. His father had died of stomach cancer, and when he died 6 years later on St. Helena, modern doctors have looked back at how he died, and it's highly likely that he had stomach cancer as well. And it is possible at the time of Waterloo that was beginning to manifest itself. We do know also that he had really bad hemorrhoids, so being on a horse too long wasn't very comfortable for him. So there's Napoleon, military genius, Emperor of France, pretty much undefeatable. The big difference between him and Wellington was that Napoleon propagated this almost godlike quality about himself. Was it egotism or just actually clever use of his own personality? Basically, the French Grande Armée almost idolised him like a minor deity. He was the emperor. You know, the last thing that would be on guys' lips as they were dying on the battlefield would be "Vive l'Empereur." So he had this love for his men, but he made sure that his men had this adoration of him, and it was almost like an adoration, worship of the emperor. Now we get to the Duke of Wellington, very different kettle of fish. He's often portrayed as cold and heartless. Famous quotes like the British Army are the scum of the earth, you know, the riffraff, scum and all that. He may have said that, and he may have looked quite diffident, but let's not forget, you've got a Frenchman and an Englishman. But actually, that's not quite true, because after some of the battles that he fought, especially the Peninsular War, when he saw the casualty figures, he was known to break down and weep when he looked at the men he'd lost. And unlike Napoleon, Wellington would do his utmost to protect his boys. Napoleon would be quite happy to throw 3 or 4 corps into the maelstrom to win. Wellington really did look after his troops and was reluctant to lose troops just on gambles and risks. So he was known by comparison to Napoleon as more of a defensive general, but what he did in the Peninsular War wasn't always defensive, because he beat everybody that was sent against him. And there's another big difference. Up until Waterloo, Napoleon had never fought against Wellington. Wellington did all his fighting in Spain, in the Spanish Peninsula, the Peninsular War, and there he fought many of the marshals and generals that he was going to meet at Waterloo. And he beat every single one of them. He was undefeated, Wellington. So, Napoleonic Wars crack on. 1814, things have gone so bad for the French that Napoleon is holed up in Paris and he's forced to abdicate. The nations around him, Austria, Russia, Prussia, the Netherlands, the British, we've basically hemmed him in and he's forced to abdicate, 1814. I'll have to refer to there's lots of dates, so I don't want to get too bogged in. But let's just let you know this. So 1814, he's sent to the island of Elba. March the 1st, 1815, March the 1st, he leaves Elba and he comes over to France, okay? He's heard bad things about the King, Louis XVIII, so he decides to come back to France for one last gamble. And when he arrives on French soil, what starts is the 100 days. It's called the 100 Days Campaign. So the 1st of March he lands in France, 20th March he's in Paris, 15th of June, Napoleon crosses Sambre, the river, at Charleroi. So he lands on the 1st of March. By the 15th of June, he's leading his Grand Armée again across the river at Sambre at Charleroi. And his, first slide please, darling. His crossing the Sambre, he wants to basically come between Wellington and Blucher. What the Allies did once Napoleon came back was quite a weird thing. They declared war on him. And this is a weird historical thing. The alliance, the Russians, the Austrians, the British and the Prussians, declared war on Napoleon. They didn't actually declare war on France. They just said, we declare war upon you, which must have rubbed his ego quite fiercely, I'd have thought. So what he did was basically he marched across the border into Belgium, and his idea was to take on each army individually, separate them, divide and conquer. So his first initiative was to cross Sambre to Charleroi and come between Wellington with the Allied army, I'm going to call it the Allied army now because it's not a British army, and the Prussian army. Defeat Wellington, defeat Blucher, and then in turn take on Barclay de Tollier and Schwarzenberg with the Austrian army. 1815, June the 16th. So what Napoleon does, he marches his army towards the British and the Prussians and separates it into 2 sections. One section under Marshal Ney takes on Wellington at a place called Quatre Bras. For those who speak French, that means 4 arms, doesn't it? Napoleon marches on towards Blucher to fight Blucher at Ligny. So this is June the 16th. Napoleon beats the Prussians. Ney, it's basically advance to contact what happens. It's a full-blown battle there, but Ney is an advance to contact with Wellington and the Allied troops. Some more Allied troops coming in, more French troops are coming in there. So that ends up being a draw with Wellington pulling back to a place called Mont Saint-Jean. Now here's something that's really between Ligny and Napoleon's battle there in Quatre Bras was a a division, a corps, led by Marshal d'Erlon, Frenchman. And Napoleon called d'Erlon to come to Ligny to help him beat Blucher. While d'Erlon's corps was moving to Ligny, Ney thought, oh no, I need d'Erlon's corps here. So he sent a message to d'Erlon's corps to come back. And d'Erlon basically did a bit of a ping-pong thing, so he actually ended up missing both battles. And the weird thing is, if he'd have got to Ligny as Napoleon was defeating the Prussians, they would have completely annihilated the Prussians. If he'd have got to Ney at Quatre Bras, they would have severely trounced the Allied army of Wellington. So it's one of those weird, there's lots of weird things that happens in battles. This weird thing, Napoleon's saying come here, Ney's saying come here, he's going backwards and forwards like a fiddler's elbow, maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but he's caught between the two, doesn't take part in any battle. A victory, but not a decisive victory, and basically Wellington as a fighting withdrawal back to Mont-Saint-Jean. Next one, please. So this is where Wellington withdraws to. If you're not used to seeing battle maps, basically blue is French, yeah? Red is British, orange and green are the Allies. Now the Allies, if we look at the forces at Waterloo, Wellington, so this is the mythbuster part of the thing, we think of Waterloo as a great British victory. Well, this is what Wellington's army, Allied army was. There were 23,000 Brits, but in that army were 44,000 Allies. That's Dutch, Belgian, Nassau, Hanoverians. And within the British army, there was an elite corps, and they were quite elite, called the King's German Legion. Guess where they came from? Yeah? And they were an elite corps. The only cavalry regiment to break an infantry square were the heavy dragoons of the King's German Legion in the Peninsular War. So it shows you how well armed they were. So you can see that it's quite a homogeneous group, Wellington's army. Napoleon's army, also notice the 160 guns. Napoleon's army, the Grand Armée, was 64,000. He had 250 guns, and Blucher, he had 48,000. Sorry, forgot to find out how many guns he had. But the way Blucher fights on the day, the artillery was important, but not as important as these in fixed positions. Remember, Napoleon started his life as an artilleryman, and he loved his cannon. And at Waterloo, he set up a thing called the Grand Battery. It was about 80 cannon here. I mean, those 250 cannon were interspersed, but there was one big group somewhere around about here, the Grand Battery, 80 cannon, and they were firing pretty much non-stop through the whole day. So let's have a look at the features of this. So I went to Waterloo last year. Some of you heard me say that. So I want you to think of this as a very slight valley running this way, a slight rise here, a slightly steeper rise going up there, and that is what you would call a reverse slope. So from here, you can see that line, but what's over there, you can't quite make it out, and that's to play a very important part in the battle. So we've got three main strongholds. We've got Papelotte, which I haven't really read much about. It doesn't sound like much happened there, but there are these two key buildings, fortified buildings, La Haye-Sainte and Hougoumont. Hougoumont, as you can see, sticks out on the English right flank, deep into the heart of where the French are. But La Haye-Sainte, smaller farm building, is at the heart of the Allied position. So if it's got two triangles, that's cavalry. If it's a solid block, it's infantry. Everyone got that? So you've got these weird little triangles, that's cavalry units, straight blocks, infantry. Okay, so just have a butcher's at that. Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, don't worry too much about Papelotte. And the ground, so I've been studying Waterloo for a long time. And I went there last year, and the biggest shock I got when I got to Waterloo was how small the battlefield is. Having seen the film, I expected to be like miles, but actually it's unbelievably small area, and that's even more shocking when we get to the end of the battle. Okay, Maestro, next one. So, British infantry, there's a bit of a clue here. Redcoats, pretty obvious. Oh, what's going on? Oh, disco, what's going on?
I didn't touch it. I don't know what's going on.
I had that effect. I had this effect on IT. So this is British infantry. These are sort of more light infantry. They've got the stovepipe shako, sergeant with a sash. Let me just run through very quickly. So the musket that the British used and the French and the Allied troops used was, we had the Brown Bess. The French had a thing called the Charleville. If you can look at the back here, there's a pouch belt there. That pouch belt comes over the shoulder and there's a pouch box.
Sorry, do you want me to go back?
No, that's fine. Stay there. So basically what happened is, I'll quickly run through it. So they had a pouch belt there. There was a little wooden attachment, and in that pouch belt, a cartouche box, cartouche being French for bullets, maybe not. Cartridge, excellent. That's why I've got you at the front. And in this was a little former that contained paper tubes. And what you would do is, you take out the paper tube, you bite the top off of it, you get your musket, and you'd half cock this thing here, okay? Priming. You'd half cock it, and then you'd fill that pan there, lift it up, and you fill that pan with a bit of gunpowder, okay? Close it up, put the rest of the powder cartridge in there, and a ball. And here, there is a ramrod. What you would do is you take the ramrod out, and then ram that home, making sure you put the ramrod back in, cock the lever back, and then it was ready to fire. We have expressions like half-cocked, going off half-cocked, and flash in the pan from mistakes you could make if you did this too quickly. Okay, so a little bit of nerdiness there. The other thing that troops would sometimes do in the heat of battle, and I'm sure no one's ever panicked about anything in this room, but some of these troops did when they were under fire, and occasionally they'd forget to take the ramrod out, and they'd fire it, and bodies were found with ramrods in them. But the only problem is, once you'd fired the ramrod, you couldn't use the weapon anymore. So it was a good kill first time, but then you were screwed. Notice the triangular bayonet, not really changed much from Rorke's Drift. Triangular in cross section, probably, I think it's about 14 inches, 12, 14 inches long. These are the guards. These are the guys that we in English folklore say held and defended Hougoumont. Remember Hougoumont, the farm down here? British Guards. There was the 2nd Battalion, the 3rd Battalion Scots Guards, and various other. The light regiments were in there, the light companies were in there first, but then they were supported through the day. Next one, please. So now we have the British Cavalry, Life Guards, Horse Guards. Now the Household Cavalry, you see them on Trooping in the Colour, that's what it looked like at Waterloo. 6 Dragoons, the Inner Skillings, 6th Dragoon Officer, they will be part of the Union Brigade. Household Brigade, Union Brigade. You come across those a bit later. Next, please. Scots Greys. Now the guys we've just looked at come under the term heavy cavalry. Heavy cavalry. Heavy cavalry is what it says on the box. Bigger men on bigger horses. Light cavalry, lighter men, lighter horses, and slightly more sexier costumes. That's lovely, isn't it? Oh, I fancy walking around the station like that. Okay, next one. So now we come to the French forces. French artillery. Remember Napoleon's Grand Battery. He's got 250 guns, one in a group of 80. Then his light cavalry, hussars. Look at those glorious uniforms. Said Napoleon was a man of many talents. Napoleon actually designed many of the uniforms in the French army. And then more French artillery. Next one, please. French infantry. They will be doing a lot of chomping around the battlefield and dying later. Next one, please. These boys, French cuirassiers. Notice the breastplate. Could stop a bullet at deflection, but close up and personal, the bullet would go through. Armoured cavalrymen. The French had cuirassiers. They'll come into the battle quite a lot later. They also had carabiniers as well. And they wore a bronze breastplate, bronze headdress that looked very much like the old Greek hoplites. Next one, please. Here they are. Talk of the devils. The carabiniers. Isn't that gorgeous, eh? I could see myself wearing that. Okay, next one. Can you ride a horse? No, sport. French line lancers. Notice the lance as like the 17th Lancers when we did the Balaclava one. That will come into play later. Next one, please. The Imperial Guard. We talked about the King's German Legion being a bit of an elite within Wellington's army. The Imperial Guard, the French Imperial Guard, was the uber elite of the French army. So we got a cavalryman, a Royal Horse Artillery, a cavalryman, a Horse Artillery, a Marine, and then a chasseur of the Imperial Guard and the Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard. Notice these guys are... Oh, that was... Yeah. These guys are wearing the Légion d'honneur. So the Grenadiers and chasseurs of the Imperial Guard, especially the Grenadiers, used to wear a little earring, gold earring. They were veterans, and many of those guys had been with Napoleon through all his campaigns, and that's how you got to be a Grenadier of the Imperial Guard. And their nickname was the Old Grumblers. We have a similar thing in the fire service, don't we? People who've been in the job more than 15 years turn into old grumblers. Nothing new under the sun. Next one, please. More French Lancers. Those are the Dutch Lancers. Next one. But they fought for France. This is the French Imperial Guard Horse Grenadiers. Trumpeters to communicate commands across the battlefield. Next one. French Imperial Guard Dragoons. Empress Dragoons, named after the Empress. Next. And back to the battlefield. So here are your cavalry. Here are your infantry, more French cavalry. Remember these strong points, Le Haye-Sainte and Hougoumont. Right, okay. So, the night before Waterloo, I said about strange things happened. When the Allied army got into position, nightfall came in, long and slow, as it does. It's June the 18th, summertime, and then the heavens opened. And it's one of these weird quirks of fate when it comes to wars and battles and crazy stuff. It didn't just rain. You read first-hand accounts, guys said it was almost of epic biblical proportions. The rain just came hammering down. There was thunders, there was lightning. One guy called it a hurricane. But that was to play a big part in what was going to happen a few hours later. The cavalry, what I'm going to try and do is as we go through the battle, we're going to look at it through the eyes of individuals. So here, you see Ponsonby. In that group is the Scots Greys, the Union Brigade, guys with the red jackets and bear skins. Their horses were so terrified by the night storm and the rain that in the morning their horses, remember big horses, they had to be dug out because they had stomped and stamped in fear so much through the night that they were in the mud up to their knees. So that shows you how awful a torrential downpour it had been. When the sun came up on June the 18th, Sunday, June the 18th, the ground was like a quagmire. Now, cannons fired different types of munition. The famous one is obviously just round shot. And it's basically a big metal ball that fires at you and it doesn't stop until it's run out of velocity or piled through 7 or 8 bodies. And that's what cannonballs used to do. They would just go through lines of men, either bifurcating people or taking off arms and legs and heads. Then there was grape and canister, and that was basically a similar munition that was used when troops were getting close up, and that contains balls and fragments in a linen bag. So basically it throws out like a shotgun. It's a cannon equivalent to a shotgun. That was used when your troops got close up. So remember that, round shot and grape shot. So Sunday morning, and Napoleon wants to get the battle started. He doesn't want the Prussians to join up with Wellington. The Prussians have gone east. Napoleon has detached 30,000 men under Marshal Grouchy to stop Blücher coming back and joining up with Wellington. Now, Grouchy, when you read about Grouchy, is basically described as a man who lacked initiative, was very good at doing as he was told. Probably not the best man to send out to try and keep somebody away from joining up with Wellington. So Grouchy went off, supposedly stopping Blücher coming back and joining up with Wellington. That will come into play later. So Napoleon wants to get started. He wants to defeat Wellington to get on towards Brussels. That is the main road that goes up to Brussels. The ground won't let him. What's his big thing? His artillery. He wants his artillery to be effective. When you're firing cannonballs into mud, Just doesn't work. So he waits 1 hour, he waits 2 hours, he waits 3 hours. Sun comes up about 6:37. The Battle of Waterloo doesn't start till 11:35 on Sunday morning. And those hours will make a big difference as we go on later. If you hadn't had that rain started at the crack of dawn, this could have been a completely different outcome to the battle. So his first attack is on Hougoumont. Right, I need you to zip through them.
Faster.
Yeah, until I say stop.
No.
Yeah, stop! Okay, that was just a test. So this is Hougoumont, okay? So there's the fortified building. There is a garden wall. This all stands today. This is wonderful. So there's a gate there, quite a substantial gate there, a small door there, and a large gate there. So Wellington's forces are up here. So we like to think the Guards just held all this. But here's your first myth-busting thing. Let me give you the breakdown of what exactly was going on there. So the Guards there were actually 2 light companies of the 2nd and 3rd Foot Guards, 200 men. But there was also 800 men of the Nassau Regiment. There was 100 men of the Hanoverian Feldjägers, and there was 200 men of the Lüneburg Jägers, so they were Allied troops. So ultimately, Hougoumont was not defended just by the Guards, it was defended by 1,300 men, of which at the outset only 200 men were Guardsmen. So as you can see, Johnny Foreigner actually outnumbers the British Guards, irrespective of what military legend seems to want to make us think. Basically, the Allied troops basically defended the Great Wood and the Orchard, and the Nassau groups would come into the main section here, the Garden Wall, and defend the Garden Wall. So the first attack starts with Riel's Corps, 11:35, and this is a distraction. Napoleon sends Riel's Corps of about, overall through the day, 6,000 men will be committed to this, where you've got about, 12,000 there at the moment. And the idea is he's doing that as diversion to see if he can get Wellington to weaken his line to come and support this. Now, Wellington's a wily old fox and he doesn't fall for it. But this battle, which was meant to be a diversion, will draw more and more French troops into it as they desperately try and take that farmhouse. And the ironic thing is, when you look at where the farmhouse was, it was not that important. It was not strategically that important. It was way out on the limb. People said, oh yeah, if the French had taken that, Napoleon could have done a massive outflanking movement. No, he could have done that anyway and completely gone round Hougoumont. So that was another one of these weird things that Napoleon, because he was not on his best game, this wasn't young Napoleon more, this was old, hemorrhoid-ridden, possibly starting with, you missed the hemorrhoid thing, didn't you? With stomach cancer starting already. So, next one. That is happening at 11:35. Nearly 6,000 French troops will be drawn into that battle. This is a lot of simultaneous activity. So Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, there is simultaneous activity while the other fights are going on. Occasionally, Wellington will reinforce Hougoumont with more Allied troops from Germany, Belgium, and from the Guards units, but predominantly it will be mainly Allied troops defending Hougoumont. So, by the time we get to about 1 o'clock, the Grand Battery starts opening up. Remember, they're sort of about here, and Napoleon decides to do his first major attack, his first serious major attack. Wellington's not been conned, he's not sent too many troops over there, there's not been a massive change in his line. Napoleon gets his infantry division moving. So this is D'Erlon, remember we mentioned D'Erlon earlier, messing around between Ligny and Quatre Bras. D'Erlon starts moving forward with four and a bit infantry divisions. And why I say 4 and a bit, because one of those divisions is split in half and told to take the farmhouse at La Haye-Sainte. Okay? 4 massive divisions, 15,000 infantrymen, French infantrymen in 4 massive columns, moving slightly down into the dip and then up to the defensive line where the Allied troops are waiting. Right, I want you to flip forward quickly. Right, keep going, faster. That's up, back. Right, so this is what La Haye-Sainte looked like. So just like Hougoumont was a battle that went on through the day, the Battle of Les Haye-Sainte went on at various points through the whole battle. And who was defending Les Haye-Sainte? Colonel Baring and the 2nd Battalion of the King's German Legion Light Infantry. And they, like the 95th Rifles, wore green. Hands up those people who saw it in Sharp? Yeah. Sharp, yeah? Well, Sharp and the light infantry, the 95th Rifles, were armed with a Baker rifle, which worked a little bit like that, but different. The Baker rifle was more accurate. The Brown Bess and the Charleville musket was designed to fire en masse, lines of 70, 140 men. Wait till the enemy gets about 50 yards away from you. You open with a volley, and hopefully one of those bullets is going to hit an enemy. The accuracy of the Brown Bess musket and the Charleville musket was pretty grim. That's why it was fired en masse. And even then, they reckoned only about 5 to 8% of the bullets actually hit another human being. So I don't know where all those bullets went, but they were notoriously bad. The big difference with the 95th Rifles and the King's German Legion is they were armed with a Baker rifle. It took longer to load because they used to have to wrap the ball in linen or silk and ram it home, and it was often quite difficult to get in the initial orifice at the top of the rifle. So they had a little hammer or a forcer, and then they could ramrod it down. But it was accurate to up to 300 yards. So, who remembers the story of Rifleman Plunkett in the Peninsular War? He shot a French general from 300 yards. He lay on the ground and put the musket between his crossed legs and shot a French general at 300 yards in the Peninsular War, the other side of a river. So, we've got the King's German Legion in this fortified building. There's an orchard. This is a casualty clearing station. And actually here, you can't see it. Well, there's a brief allusion. There is a sand pit or a quarry pit. And one unit of the 95th Rifles are there. So as d'Erlon's corps starts moving through, you get two units that are told to take Les Haye-Sainte. So there's about 2,000 French infantrymen are told to take Les Haye-Sainte, that fortified farm. That farm is still in existence as a farm today at Waterloo. You can't go in because it's still a working farm. It's pretty much in amazing condition. Colonel Baring has got just up to 400 German soldiers in there with their Baker rifles, and they fight like tigers to keep the French out. Okay, back to where we were. So that's going on as d'Erlon's. So this is d'Erlon's infantry moving out. Marconnet, Donzelot, they're two of the commanders of d'Erlon's division. And as they move up towards the crest, they had specifically, the French infantry moved forward in what they call columns. The British infantry always moved in lines. They fought in lines or moved in lines, sometimes 2 deep, sometimes 4 deep. And they'd done that all through the Peninsular War. It was so that they could bring a lot of musketry onto the enemy. The French liked columns, and they were obviously very, very deep. But specifically for this attack, they'd extended the width of their column to 140 men wide. So you got 4 columns, even though there's just 2 arrows, there are actually 4 columns, moving up to that ridge. Beitland's brigade, an Allied brigade, is on that ridge, and as the French come up to the top of it, you can see this hedge line, they push them back. That Allied unit starts crumbling and starts being pushed back. At that point, British infantry start moving forward to support them, and there's a firefight literally on that ridge, either side of the hedge. Most of the French have got on the other side of the hedge, and slowly but surely, the French, 15,000 French infantrymen are beginning to push the British infantry back. You've got the 92nd Highlanders there, you've got the 42nd Highlanders, all fighting like crazy, but they're losing the firefight, obviously, with that many French coming towards them, French infantry, infantry on infantry. Bayonet to bayonet did not happen as much as we are led to believe, so the British infantry start to crumple back. And then something else happens. Ponsonby and Somerset. Somerset is the officer in charge of the household brigade. Ponsonby is in charge of the Union Brigade. The Union Brigade consists of the Scots Greys, the Inniskilling Dragoons, and the Royal Dragoons. So that's Scots, Irish and English. Somerset's brigade consists of 1st and 2nd Life Guards, Royal Horse Guards and the King's Dragoon Guards. Just at the point where it looks like 15,000 French infantry are going to sweep Wellington off the battlefield, the British heavy cavalry charge in two cohesive units. Ponson Brigade's Union Brigade, you can see the arrows there, self-explanatory. Somerset's Brigade, one group goes this side, one group's that side. Supporting D'Erlon's infantry is hundreds of French cuirassiers, and they will come up later, and there's a massive cavalry engagement goes on. So next slide, please. Then you get the charge of the Union Brigade. Painting by Lady Butler, if you were at the Light Brigade thing, and the Rorke's Drift, you know Lady Butler was a Victorian painter. She was a painter, loved painting battle scenes. It's hard to find women like that nowadays, isn't it? Loved painting battle scenes, and this is her version of the Scots Greys charging into the French infantry. This is what she thought would be the last thing that many of those French infantrymen would see. Not quite true, because the Scots Greys and the Union Brigade had to move through a hedge, a sunken road, and then into the French infantry. So they were probably not doing much more than a trot when they smashed into the French infantry. Next one, please. And that's what happened. The Union Brigade literally went through the French infantry like a hot knife through butter. There were two French flags captured by the Union Brigade. One was captured by Captain Kennedy and Corporal Stiles. Captain Kennedy and Corporal Stiles took the standard of the 105th Infantry Regiment. This is Sergeant Charles Ewart of the Scots Greys capturing the standard of the French 45th Regiment. And we're going to join him now. As the Scots Greys got over the hedge, the officer that he was sort of guarding, a French officer went to surrender to him. So the officer passed him by and just nodded to him, and as he passed him by, the dastardly French officer then shot him through the back. Ewart saw what had happened to his officer, turned round, went at the French officer, and heavy cavalry swords. I'm fortunate enough to have been able to hold some of the swords that were held at Waterloo. It's not much different from waiting as a hooligan bar. Imagine a sharpened hooligan bar. So basically, Ewart just decapitated the French officer and went back and joined the charge. Then he attacked the standard. It says that he slashed the standard bearer down through the head and took the standard from him. There is a problem now. Go back. What happens is the British cavalry, overawed at their success, began to continue their charge through the French infantry. So they reckon there were, of the 15,000 French infantry, 5,000 became casualties and 2,000 were taken prisoner. Obviously, droves of them would start heading back to the French lines. Unfortunately, the British cavalry were renowned for being poorly disciplined when it came to regrouping after charges. And sorry for racial stereotypes, but we're talking about Scotsmen with their blood up, and basically they just kept going. If they'd have stopped, it would have been wonderful. But we don't know how big a contingent, some say it was about 50, 60 or so, but a contingent led by their commander, Ponsonby, carried on through the infantry, saw the Grand Battery and thought, look, let's go and attack that now. So off they went up the other side into the Grand Battery. And the trouble is, horses are not like cars. They are not indefatigable. And as they took the Grand Battery and started sabring the gunners, the French responded with their line lancers and charged the Scots Greys. And you can guess what happened. The Scots Greys were on blown horses. They've basically gone through an area which is churned up by thousands of infantrymen and even their own horses, and trying to get back, basically most of the Scots Greys, their horses got bogged down and they got slaughtered, including Colonel Ponsonby, the officer in charge of the Scots Greys. And the French cavalry attacks did account for a lot of the losses. The attack over here between Somerset's Household Brigade and the Cuirassiers was quite a fair old ding-dong, but eventually the Cuirassiers gave way and took up refuge in some dead ground here, and they will come up later. So you've got Hougoumont, that happens 11:35. This happens about 1 o'clock. This is all over by about 2:30. We've seen Napoleon's first major attack on Wellington's line repulsed by British cavalry. Some have gone too far and they are drawn back, and we are getting towards the end of the first major attack. Next one, please. Scots Greys, Ewart, next one. Now, at this point, Le Haye-Sainte still hasn't fallen. The King's German Legion have held away those 2 French units, 2,000 strong, that tried to take them, but obviously they have taken casualties. They are reinforced from the British lines with a couple of battalions, but then there was some strange things that would happen. You know, I told you about the cuirassiers hiding in dead ground here. Has anyone heard of the Prince of Orange? Yeah. The Prince of Orange. He was obviously the Dutch guy in charge. No, he made probably a relative. So the Prince of Orange. If you've ever seen Sharp's Waterloo, he's played by Paul Bettany. And this is what was said of the Prince of Orange. An arrogant fool, a disaster waiting to happen, a dangerous lunatic. That was by his contemporaries. So the Prince of Orange, who was in position here, at various times sent 2 or 3 units down to try and support the King's German Legion, and he sent them down in line formation. And line formation is very good for shooting other infantry, but it's really bad news if there are cavalry around. And I think it was 3 times altogether the Prince of Orange sent units down in line, and guess what happened? French cuirassiers came out and almost slaughtered each one to a man. And he made that mistake more than once through the course of the battle. So by 3 o'clock, Ney wants to take that farm, because if he takes that farm, then the French have got like a thumb slap bang almost in the middle of the British lines. The distance from there to there, if I remember right, is about 120 yards, not far. Wellington's Elm, that weird little thing is called Wellington's Elm. It's a tree stood by occasionally. So Ney takes another unit in to try and take Le Haye-Sainte. Once again, the King's German Legion fight them off, and those attacks were repulsed. And they are outnumbered probably somewhere in the region of 10 to 1, 15 to 1, but the Germans still hold. The only problem is, with all these attacks coming their way, they're losing men and they're losing ammunition. The King's German Legion, that unit's ammunition wagon had been overturned on the retreat from Quatre Bras to Waterloo. Major Baring sends up the first of 4 orders for more ammunition. Okay, so we get to about 3 o'clock. That's failed. Ney comes down. It is thought that sometime about now Napoleon was taken ill. There's a lot of controversy about what went on at Waterloo. Even putting these figures together, depending on where you look, the figures change. The basic timings are right. But at some point about 3:30, Ney sees the Allied line, or parts of the Allied line, being pulled back to reverse slope. Do you remember what I meant about reverse slope? Troops on the reverse slope are protected from the cannon fire. And Ney thinks that's Wellington's line crumbling. So he gets it in his head, if Wellington's line's crumbling, all we need now is a cavalry charge and we can push through to Brussels. So Ney decides to mobilise somewhere in the region of 5,500 French cuirassiers to attack the crest, go over the crest and cause Wellington's army to flee. And that's what happens. He initiates one of the largest cavalry charges seen in the Napoleonic Wars. 5,500 French cuirassiers, remember the guys in the breastplates and the horsehair plumes. Other infantry would be drawn into this. And as the, next slide please, as the French cavalry move up, they come over the crest of the hill, and no prizes for guessing what they find. British infantry have formed squares, and squares, think of a hedgehog. Think of a Jack Russell trying to get a hedgehog. It's virtually impossible. No matter how mean the Jack Russell is, that hedgehog is just invulnerable. And that's what happened. The French cavalry came over the hill and were confronted by the British infantry in these squares. So basically the front man was kneeling, the 2 ranks behind were able to fire. The guys kneeling, obviously bayonets presented forward. It created an impenetrable wall of bayonets that the cavalry and the horses just would not be able to get through. And through the course of the next 2 hours, and again there's a conflicting reports now, some say as few as 6 and some say as many as 15, somewhere in between, say 8, make it 8. 8 times French cavalry charged those squares, and 8 times they couldn't break through. At various points, the other French cavalry regiments were brought in, so not just French cuirassiers, you brought in French dragoons, French chasseurs, French lancers, the Red Lancers, all desperately trying to get into those squares. So now we've had a little look at Sergeant Ewart. We're going to look at a guy called Captain Mercer, who was in charge of the Royal Horse Artillery. So what the artillery did, as the French cavalry came up, right to the last minute, they were firing grape shot, you know, all that horrible stuff. Well, what Mercer did, he was out on the right wing a little bit. He decided, when he looked at the square that he was due to run into, was looking a bit shaky. It was actually a Belgian square. He thought, you know what, I'm not going to take refuge. I'm just going to stay here and keep firing. And miraculously, the French literally bypassed him, and Mercer kept up firing grape shot into the side of the French cavalry for a whole one of those charges. And if you read his personal account, it's horrific what that stuff does to men and horses. Just unbelievable. The guys in the squares were ordered by their officers not to shoot the men, shoot the horses. The centre of the squares, obviously, there were casualties taken by the British infantry. They weren't not being hit because French cavalry were also armed with pistols. Some of the light cavalry were armed with small carbines, so they were being shot at as well. Also, the French were supported by their own horse artillery, so there was artillery fire coming in occasionally. And basically, the centre of the squares filled up as casualty clearing places, but there was nowhere to clear them to. It was just piles of wounded men. Dead troops, you wouldn't get away with this nowadays, would you? Dead troops were thrown out the square to form an obstacle to the French cavalry. They had to look after people in those days, didn't they? Next, please. So here we have General Colbert of the Red Lancers attacking Highland Square. Just to give you a different illustration, cuirassier there, Red Lancer, chasseur there, trumpeter there, in opposite facing colours. Next one. Cuirassiers coming in, another visual illustration of what it would be like. There's abandoned cannons there. Obviously the gunners are hiding inside the squares. Next one, please. So, and the next one. Now, while all this is going, simultaneous activity, we've got Hougoumont being defended, nearly 6,000 French troops being drawn into that. It's now getting on towards 5 o'clock, and the Prussians have not been kept away by Monsieur Grouchy. And they've come in on Wellington's left flank. So, play back again. Sorry, mate, this is why I got you. Keep going. Keep going. Stop! That. The Prussians are beginning to arrive, and they are beginning to move into this area called Plancenoit, or Plancenoir. Plancenoir is actually a small town, so this is an urban battle that starts to take place. About 5:30, the Prussians are coming in on Wellington's left flank, and Napoleon's nightmare is beginning to happen. And the Prussians, by 5:30, 6 o'clock, have actually taken Plancenoir. Napoleon then has to deflect some of his Imperial Guard, and they storm into Plancenoir and retake it. It's about 6 o'clock now, so this is all simultaneous activity. We've got basically urban warfare going on here, the Hougoumont thing still going on here, the French cavalry have been charging up and down like fiddler's elbows, not getting anywhere, just getting more and more casualties, and now it's about 6 o'clock. Back, please.
Back.
Yeah. All the while, the Prussians are moving closer to this edge, okay? So, it's at this point, Napoleon's obviously back on the scene, and Ney is told he must take Les Haye-Sainte. You must take Les Haye-Sainte. So he goes with 2 fresh units and an engineer battalion who are designed to use axes. French sappers and engineers carried huge axes, and their job, you must take Les Haye-Sainte. By now, the King's German Legion are almost out of ammunition. And Major Baring sends his 4th and final order up to the Allied lines for ammunition, and guess what? None turns up. So Ney attacks Les Haye-Sainte with a couple of thousand troops of these engineers. The King's German Legion fight like billy-o. The French set fire to the roofs, and eventually The King's German Legion are down to about 100 men. The French actually smashed through the main doors here that come onto the road. There's a door here which had been broken up and used as firewood the night before. They got through there. Eventually, the King's German Legion ran completely out of ammunition, and Bering ordered a fighting retreat back to the Allied lines, and 42 men got back. And the French finally took over Le Haye-Sainte about 6:40, 6:35. At last, the French had that salient into the Allied lines. And it was at this point Wellington was thinking this could go either way. But he knows the Prussians are coming. And for about half an hour, if it had been the younger Napoleon, and about this point now, Napoleon had started his Imperial Guard attack, it is highly likely they would have broken through and won the Battle of Waterloo. But for some reason, he dillied and dallied about half an hour, 45 minutes, and that can make a big difference in a battle. More and more Prussians are coming here. The Prussians are actually beginning to join up with Allied troops at Papelotte, so they're actually sweeping in on the whole of Wellington's left flank. I don't know where Grouchy is. He's still faffing around on Wavre with one of Blucher's smaller divisions. Okay, next one, please.
Back, forward.
So, 7:30. Napoleon's keep going. Final gamble. Keep going. Keep going. It's now time to win. Stop. Waterloo. So this is the map now. We've got the Prussians, Zieten, Blucher, Bülow, Plancenoit, pretty much taken. Prussians coming in this side. Napoleon decides to do his final gamble, and he sends forward his Imperial Guards. That's the Chasseurs, the Grenadiers with supporting artillery. And 3 massive columns of the Imperial Guard start moving up this side. So this is the area where the cavalry charges have been taking place, and these 3 mighty attacks take place of the Imperial Guard. Remember the guys with the big bear skins, the big epaulettes, and they move up through the area where the cavalry's charged, over dead cavalrymen, dead horses, and they get to the crest of the ridge. And the attack comes in 3 waves. The first wave of Chasseurs gets there. Wellington, little do the French know, has fortified that line, and he's got Maitland there, and he's told Maitland and his battalions to lie down in the corn. The French Imperial Guard Chasseurs look to the ridge, and it looks like it's empty. They look like this is it, victory is ours. As they crest the ridge, Wellington shouts at Maitland, Maitland, now's your time. And with that, hundreds of British infantrymen step up out of the corn and open fire on that first major columns of Chasseurs of the Imperial Guard. And the effect was withering. The Guard, the front ranks were completely decimated. They kept the fire up. They tried to return fire, but it wasn't long before that first attack began to falter and to move down the hill. The next wave of the French attack was near where the Prince of Orange was, and the Belgian troops there began to give way, and it looked like that attack might get through. And there was an Allied general, Chasseur, I think his name was, if I remember rightly, a Belgian guy. He moved his troops in the gap, moved in some artillery, and started to hammer it at that French Imperial Guard Grenadier attack that was moving in there. The third attack, which moved into the same area roughly where the first attack was, that was shot in the flank by the 52nd Infantry Regiment by a chap called Colburn, and they poured a withering fire into the side of that French column. And basically the unimaginable thing happened that had never happened to the French army in nearly 2 decades of warfare. The French Imperial Guard began to pull back. And the next thing was "Les gardes reculent," which is French for the guard run away. And basically what happened then, panic literally spread like wildfire through the whole of the French army. As the Imperial Guard began to pull back, the whole of the French army disintegrated. Like, you just can't imagine what it was like, how much the fear and panic. The people shouting, the Prussians are upon us, the Prussians are upon us, the Guard recule, and in half an hour the French army was in full retreat, and Wellington gave the order for a general advance. So basically anybody who was still on his feet moved forward down that hill, and the Battle of Waterloo was over. And it was about 9 o'clock at night. Wellington met Blücher at La Belle Alliance, shook his hand, said well done. And we have now a great song from ABBA to commemorate this. I think, I was desperately trying to think, I think that's the only pop song dedicated to a battle. And then when you think about what happened there on the day, you can understand why. But what did happen there on the day, and let's shock ourselves with some of the most... So on this field of battle, so mainly this section here, there were 15,000 Allied casualties, 6,540 killed in action. So definitely 6,500 bodies in that area who are Allies. Napoleon had 25,000 casualties in that area, of which 10,800 are killed in action. All those bodies in that area. And Blücher lost 1,144 killed in action. That would be mainly over in this area here. That's just human beings. I haven't got a figure for horses. It must have been absolutely horrendous. And the weirdest thing of all was the guys who were at the battle were so exhausted that many of them, when the French withdrew from Waterloo, the fighting, the pursuing army was given to the Prussians. The Prussians were happy to go after the French. They really detested the French. We had a sort of grudging admiration for the French. It worked both ways. But Blücher and the Germans, or the Prussians, they really hated the French, so they were happy to go hammering after the French as they retreated from Waterloo. But many of the guys just literally collapsed where they were and slept pretty much in situ with all those dead and dying around. And it's one of the weird things about Waterloo that the guys who survived were so exhausted that any thoughts of compassion or going out to see who was moaning or who was crying, hardly anyone did that. They were just too wrecked. Wellington, after the Battle of Waterloo, after all the battles in the Peninsular War, all of the officers would say to themselves, who's been killed? Who's been killed? Jenkins or Fotheringay has been killed. But after Waterloo, the officers said, who's left alive? Because so many officers were killed on both sides. But the British officers in those days would be on horses. Amongst all these guys on foot, and they'd be on horses. Picton got killed, bullet through the head. It was a big thing, and if a cannonball was coming towards them, it was considered cowardly to move out of the way. It's just like, what? So the Battle of Waterloo, a near-run thing, and it was a near-run thing. 7:30, it still could have gone either way, but Napoleon was not what he was.
Was Napoleon taken?
No, Napoleon withdrew to Paris. He was taken. He got on ship. He was taken on HMS Bellerophon, brought to England. I don't know whether he actually stepped on English soil, but he was then sent to the Isle of St Helena, where he died 6 years later of what looked like complications from stomach cancer. So if he was 47 at Waterloo, 6 years later, he died at 53, didn't he? 53. Wellington lived on to a ripe old age, died in 1852. The Iron Duke.
Twice Prime Minister.
Possibly, yeah. But Waterloo broke his heart. He may have had this tough, but he was deeply, deeply, deeply moved by what happened there. If you go to Waterloo, if you get a chance to go there, it's worth going. I mean, Hougoumont is great to see. You can't get into Le Haye-Sainte. There's a museum at Hougoumont. There's various museums down here and up there. And there's a great audio-visual thing in Hougoumont. They've replaced the original gates. There you go. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Very good.
Thank you.
Was